Welcome to this professional pensions webinar looking at the value for money conundrum, a discussion we're holding in association with Cushon. My name's Jonathan Stapleton, I'm the editor of Professional Pensions and will be your host for this session. In day-to-day life, value is something that generally means something different to every single person. In the retail sector, it's understood as the benefit that each customer gets by using a product to satisfy their individual needs minus costs. In addition to this, so many successful retail products have a range of different features and corresponding price points. The same product, but tweaked to satisfy differing needs and pockets. Fundamentally, the products respond to customer needs. But is it possible to mirror this approach within pensions and get a genuinely more personalised approach? Yesterday, the Pensions Regulator and the Financial Conduct Authority confirmed plans to develop common measurements to compare value for money across schemes, looking beyond just costs and charges and into areas such as investment performance, customer service and scheme oversight. In this webinar, our panel will discuss what value really means in pensions and how we can make sure that schemes are delivering for members. It will also debate some of the burning questions around this, such as how does consolidation help deliver value for members, whether the market is too focused on winning over employers to the detriment of members, and does lower cost always mean better value. The webinar will also look at what value technology brings, discuss why member engagement is so important, and question whether forward-looking expectations are more important than past performance. I'm delighted to be joined by our four-strong panel of experts to discuss the issues. Ben Pollard, CEO and founder at Cushon, Sir Steve Webb, former Pensions Minister and partner at Lane Clark and Peacock, Juliana Oladipo, Pensions Director for UK and Ireland at EY, and Baroness Ros Altman, Pensions Campaigner and Advisory Board Member at Cushon. Well, welcome all and thank you for joining us for this webinar. As an industry, we do a great job of defining value for money. What does value really mean from your perspective? Ben, can I come to you first?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. So we at Cushon, we sort of look at the industry somewhat as an outsider. So despite being on some measures the fifth biggest large master trust provider in the country and serving around 440,000 customers, we still think of ourselves as a tech business that happens to do financial services and happens to do pensions. And we bring that sort of lens to all of these sorts of questions and issues that we're considering, and very much sort of look at it from a customer's perspective, and like you were saying, as a sort of retail technology business competing in the cut and thrust of Google and social media and so on for eyeballs and that sort of thing. How does that lens apply to the way that the industry looks at value for money? And I think our take is, yes, you know, the industry does a good job, but I think there's also a lot of frustrations in the industry around the way that the market operates, the types of things that the market competes on, and the types of things that the market doesn't compete on, more importantly. And we see a huge opportunity, actually, right now to have a really positive impact through this value for money agenda and the consultation that's been issued or announced to be issued just yesterday, to actually have a really meaningful impact on getting the industry competing on stuff that is more important and will really support driving better outcomes for members and driving the positive impact that pension schemes and the money that they invest can have on society and the environment as a whole.
Thanks so much, Ben. Juliana, would you agree? What does value mean from your perspective?
I completely agree with all the points that Ben has made. I think as an employer, as a large employer, one of the key sort of pointers for us is member expectations. Mm-hmm. So for us is, are we meeting member expectations in terms of their retirement outcomes? And to achieve that, I think is very challenging for the industry because member expectations are very individual. You know, for some members, it's, you know, looking at the contributions that go into the scheme, which is a big factor. And for us as an employer, a big element of our total reward proposition. For other members is how they can engage and connect with their retirement savings. But I think for the industry to really succeed within this sort of dialogue and in this space, it really needs to put the member at the centre of all the conversations that are going on, because it's so easy for us to lose focus if we don't have at the heart of our discussions and our debate the member perspective. So for me, value is putting members at the heart of the debate.
Hey, Steve, what's your view on that? What does value really mean to you?
I think what's striking is that the public think that they've taken out a pension. They don't think they've taken out an accumulation pot. And that's quite important, because we focus almost exclusively on the accumulation phase. So I kind of take it as read that a member wants to see their money well invested, a good risk-adjusted rate of return, low cost, easy to use, and all of those things. But what they actually want is something to live off in retirement. And I think all too often in the DC world, for understandable reasons, we're so focused on auto-enrollment and the workplace and accumulation that we almost leave people at the starting gate, just at the point where they say, well, hang on, I've been saving with you for decades. I mean, I do casework for the Pensions Ombudsman, and I came across a case the other day, and this chap was like, no, I saved for a pension. And I say, no, you were building up a pot that you then shopped around for an annuity with. And it's, no, I was always expecting a pension on a certain date, and they didn't pay me a pension on this date. And it's like, no, but they were never going to. So I think realising that what people think they're saving for is a pension, it might not end up an annuity as such, but a good workplace pension, a good DC product, takes people not just up to retirement, but has a good plan for it. It may not be that that's the same provider, but it certainly makes that journey work into and through retirement.
Thank you. Ros, what does value mean from your perspective?
Well, I think a lot of what's said, of course, I would agree with. For me, the big missing link is the direct-to-consumer aspect of pensions. Pensions have been sold by middlemen, designed for middle people, employers organise it or advisors organise it, and individuals are not treated as individuals. There's this one-size-fits-all mentality. And for me, with freedom and choice, which I agree with, the standard approaches, which are called default funds, I hate that name, don't necessarily fit with people's lives anymore. And if you want value for money, then people need to know that the product they've got is suitable for them and will do what they need. And that, I think, means that providers should be judged on the clarity of the information they give, the ease of use, so their customers can figure out what money's gone in from them, from their employer, from the tax relief, and what that money's doing, so that they can be part of the journey of building up their financial future, if you like. And that means encouraging higher contributions through financial education, making sure there's proper guidance and financial education. The more schemes try to dumb down and have less communication, the less value for money I think that brings. But we don't measure that. We don't measure the range of so-called default options, which could individualize people's savings. And we don't measure the ease of use and the messaging. So I think I also agree that it's not just about what happens while you're building the money up in accumulating the fund, but also what happens once you reach a certain age, and how clear are the messages to you to help you not do the wrong thing. Not necessarily taking money out just because you can, not even necessarily taking your tax-free cash, but deciding how to take the money for your retirement at a point where you need it, rather than a point where your scheme has been geared to tell you you should take it, I think would be making much better use of the pension savings that people have. A lot of people take money out when they're still working, because that's the age at which they're told they can, and perhaps that almost led to believe they should. So more guidance, making sure schemes actually look after members through the life cycle, right into later life, for me would make pensions for members much better value for money. I'm not saying that's easy to measure, but we're not even really trying yet.
Thank you so much, Ros. Steve, Ros has talked about sort of that broader range of metrics for assessing value for money. Obviously, we had the Pensions Regulator and Financial Conduct Authority come out yesterday, sort of setting out its approach and committing to sort of move forward. Have they, in your view, sort of, are they on the right track from your perspective?
Well, I think one positive thing that we ought to recognise is that having the Pensions Regulator and the FCA joining forces has got to be a good thing. I mean, there are so many other bits of the pensions landscape. You look at what happens at retirement and, you know, the FCA proposed a set of rules and TPR are just getting round to thinking about whether they should do the same thing, and that's ridiculous. So bonus point for joint working. But I did read the document yesterday and it was very much, oh, it's all very difficult, isn't it? And I think we've got this fundamental problem because on all the posters that people put out for pensions, it says past performance isn't a guide to the future. You know, don't dare say we've invested money well for the last 5 years, you know, we're good people to invest in. You're not allowed to say that. And yet, of course, what do people want? They want people who are going to invest their money well. What's the only evidence we've got is the past. So unless they crack that one, this is going to be quite wishy-washy, is my worry, really. And yet it's fundamental, isn't it? The charges could differ by a few basis points. The rate of return could differ by 500 basis points, rather. And yet all we can really measure is the charges. And I think that we've got to move on from there.
Rose, you're nodding there. Would you sort of agree TPR and FCA have done a reasonable job, but we need to move on even more?
Well, I certainly agree with Steve that seeing them work together is marvellous, and I hope that will continue long into the future so that people don't get confused between different regulatory regimes and what applies to them and so on and so forth, that everybody who's in pensions have the same rules. But I also agree that, you know, the regulator is recognising at last that it's not just about charges, which its website originally, looking at value for money, led pretty much to conclude that, well, you can only compare charges, so compare charges and that'll give you an idea of good value. Of course, past performance isn't a guide, but there need to be league tables and there need to be measurements of how funds perform. And I would like to see much more emphasis on different funds, not just one standard fund. I really don't believe that lifestyle and target date funds are appropriate for the vast majority of people. They may be appropriate for a good subset, but if you don't know when you're going to stop working, you can't really decide what you're going to be talking about, what you want to do later on, and you could be coming out of higher return assets and dumbing down your retirement income. But, you know, I understand the easiest thing to measure is going to be the charges and the past performance. Those are actual figures. The rest is much more intangible. But, you know, you could have customer service ratings and, you know, assessment of the clarity of messaging and as well as the range of investment options and the ease of use.
And you want to come in there?
I mean, this is where, again, our sort of somewhat outsider perspective actually, I think, shines quite a helpful spotlight on some of these things, because I look at this, completely agree with the analysis, but there are, in other worlds, quite clearly defined ways of tackling these sorts of problems, right? So and the two that I would pinpoint, I think we've kind of all settled on the sort of charges aren't the right way to look at things. The past performance not being a guide to the future, very well trodden path, right? Everybody agrees with that, everybody knows it, and yet, you know, we are where we are in terms of the sort of messages on the consultation. Other industries have been this way before, right? In FCA land, there are rules governing the use of stochastic projections for the purposes of providing illustrations on packaged products. Like you say, are the organisations talking to each other enough? Maybe not. In PRA land, there are rules governing the use of stochastic projections for the purposes of maintaining the solvency of our insurance sector, right? Tens of billions of balance sheets being run off the back of these types of models. It is very, very, very feasible to translate those types of frameworks into the context of workplace pensions. You are then able to create a set of league tables based on forward-looking returns, and not just forward-looking most likely returns, but forward-looking good case and forward-looking bad case to help articulate the impact of risk, because obviously that's important as well, and then allow for all of the complexities of, private markets that people think might be a great diversifying asset class, and global equity indices, and the risks of exposure to oil and gas. All of these complicated industry debates that we enjoy having can actually be distilled into a set of numbers. What's the most likely return on my pot? And I can compare that. I can go to Money Supermarket and compare that to the interest rate I'm going to earn on some cash. And that's very, very doable. All of the technical sort of understanding, the governance frameworks, it's all very well-trodden paths to enabling that sort of framework to be delivered on an objective, comparable basis that enables schemes to start competing on that one of the ingredients that really matters, forward-looking returns, as opposed to sort of scrabbling around in this in the rearview mirror. The other, I'll stop in a second, but I think the other key thing, the sort of points that Ros was raising, can all be encapsulated in this concept of customer experience and user experience, and that is all super measurable, right? Again, in the tech world, there are reams of experience in measuring that sort of stuff and quantifying it, and again, reducing it effectively to league tables and things that you can rank and stack and compare one provider against the other. And so our view, when I say there's this massive opportunity, I think opening our eyes a little bit, sort of looking at the techniques that are available from other industries that can really help out this sector will be a super fruitful line of inquiry.
Steve, you want to come there on the investment side of things?
Well, it's more a postscript really, because of course, if the consumer does what Ben has said and sees all this information, other than maybe moving their money to another fund with the same provider, and all the funds of the same provider might have a lot of things in common, as things stand, they are then powerless to use that information. And I think an interesting idea would be some sort of mandatory retendering. Because it's not just inertia of the punters, it's inertia of the employers who've chosen the workplace pension scheme. And although there is a secondary market in workplace pension providers, it's pretty sticky, as I imagine you've found. So if we want new entrants, if we want people shaking things up, if we want employers to be taking account of all this, we create all this data and then nobody acts on it, that's not much use. So maybe a 3-yearly or whatever mandatory retendering might be the stick that prompts people to then react to all this data.
Thank you. Juliana, if I can focus a little bit more on something Ben and Steve have said. Obviously, the biggest single thing that drives member outcomes from that's within the remit of the provider of itself is the investment returns. What's your view on those sort of forward-looking projections? Are you sort of in favour of them? Are they something we can feasibly do as an industry?
I think Ben's point is well made. The challenge the industry has is its readiness, quite frankly. Ben talks about being a tech-first organisation within Cushon. I think a number of the sort of the big providers have got a long way to go when it comes to the technology that enables a lot of what we're talking about here today. And, we are, as an industry, quite archaic when it comes to consumer lens to delivering what is in fact a consumer product. So I do think in order for us to sort of achieve the sort of forward-looking projections in a meaningful way, we've got a big shift to make as an industry. I do think there is some value in looking back, because what it allows you to do is benchmark, how providers have performed relative to their peers. Yes, I accept the point around doesn't give you an indication of the future, but it's the only thing the industry has at the moment, which I think we need to fix. But there is some value in saying, actually, that is something we have that says in all these different scenarios, this is how this provider has performed. And that should, to some extent, impact how they should perform in the future. But I do think, in order for us to sort of move and shift the dialogue, we have to be prepared to sort of disrupt, quite frankly, how we deliver to our consumers.
Thank you very much indeed. Ros, if I can come to you, you mentioned earlier on about these middlemen that have sort of been traditionally involved in choosing pension schemes for employees, the trustees, the consultants and so forth. How should trustees and employers, in your view, be assessing value for money? And should it be found wanting, what should they be doing about it?
Well, I think some of the metrics that we've been talking about are really important for employers and consultants to consider. The best example of how little consideration may have been given in the past to the members, the end members themselves, is the proliferation of net pay arrangements that employers have used when they have low earning staff. And that has been the case for years now. Since at least 2016, the minimum threshold has strayed away from the personal tax threshold, and members have increasingly lost out if they are low earners. But the key here is that their pension hasn't had less money in it. They've had less money in their pockets. So I think, the pensions industry missed that in some ways, because the pension itself was not affected, although I'm sure that it led to many more of the low earners opting out than perhaps otherwise would. But at the end of the day, I think it really is important for us to look at metrics such as investment performance, flexibility of choice both to and through retirement, and diversity of investment options for people to be able to take an interest in and to help suit their own needs. So it's, just having low cost is bound to mean much more standardization and one size fits all. And I think what we need is much less if we're going to have proper value for money for the individuals who are saving for their retirement through their employer. They have no control over the employer scheme. So the onus is on the employer and the consultants to the employer to make sure that they have a provider that does do these things and can help their workforce.
Thank you. Ben, just flipping that around a little bit, is the market too focused, do you think, on winning over those employers as opposed to, the looking after the members per se?
I think traditionally, yes. I think there's, the providers have typically seen their customer as the employer, and it isn't, right? It isn't, absolutely not. Do I think that's the sort of biggest part of the problem? Not really, because I sort of understand it, right? Because the dynamic of the market is such that, from the provider's perspective, that is who you're selling to at the end of the day. So it's inevitable that that's the kind of way that the market will orient itself. So I think just come back to the opportunity is to define the framework that is then used and the data that's then used through that process in such a way that that process naturally focuses on the stuff that really matters, i.e. End customers. And just to sort of expand on my point around customer experience, that being the other sort of catch-all term that I would use to describe some of the points that Ros is making, this is all very measurable, right? We can measure how many people have engaged in their pension in some form and made a conscious decision to select an investment strategy that's more suitable for them. We can measure how many people have come in and chosen to increase their contributions. We can measure how many people have chosen to come in and combine all of their pots into one place and get their stuff organised. We can measure just how many people are looking at things and understanding what their likely outcome is in retirement. And to the point Steve was making at the beginning, that member that sort of, got to retirement and is then like, I was expecting, you can measure that and head it off decades earlier, right? Because if you know that there is a certain hub of people who are never engaging, you can measure that as a statistic. You can say 15% of people have not engaged with us in any meaningful form within the last 5 years, and then that gives you a metric to then get on top of that as a problem. And all of this stuff is very doable. Technology helps massively, right, in doing it, but it's not an absolute necessity. All the stuff that I just reeled off, you can measure in paper if you want to. It's just harder work.
Julianne?
I was just going to say, I think it's difficult for an employer not to focus in on costs sometimes, because that's the one thing you can easily sell to your workforce as the value that you've been able to deliver for them as an employee workforce. So, it's great to be able to say, oh, look, you've got this fantastic app and you'll get this fantastic comms sort of program, but until a member actually experiences it, they don't actually value it. So as an employer, there is a pressure to be able to say to your workforce, look, we have got you a really good deal because of our buying power or negotiation power. So that there is a bit of a challenge there. I do think there was a point around, the race to the bottom, and I think that we need to move away from that. But we mustn't forget the tangibles that, the challenges an employer faces in delivering a perceived good outcome for its workforce. It's how do you strike that balance between, being able to sell the proposition to your workforce when actually the one key factor that they're looking at is how much is it going to cost me?
Steve, thank you very much indeed. Steve, we've got a question in from our audience here. I'll put this one to you. Is the elephant in the room that we, for most schemes, that we fail to get over to members that they're actually facing poor outcomes or an uncomfortable outcome in retirement? To what extent should we sort of be looking to engage members with their sort of potential outcomes in retirement, perhaps through the PLSA's retirement living standards, to sort of add value for that member?
And I think the big challenge you've got is in a world of people changing jobs and multiple pots and all the rest of it, actually the individual provider will struggle to say to Mrs Jones in the scheme, you're heading for poverty in retirement, because the provider doesn't know. They only know about this pot and what this pot might be worth. I think, this is where we always come back to the dashboard, don't we? But I mean, once we can integrate with the dashboard, then I think you have got the potential for seeing people's position holistically. I think at the moment, there's, if Nest's got umpteen squillion members and they tell them all they've got tiny pots, that, well, so what? Because most of their pension's probably somewhere else if they've got anything else. So I think integration with the dashboard could be really important. I think the other thing I was struck on the conversation we were just having, and the more I think about this, is the employer chooses for the member and the employer chooses for the entire workforce. And they made that choice once when auto-enrolment started. And there is very little to make them make a different choice, because it's hassle. They've integrated their payroll systems. The workers have got used to the pension they've got. You're an employer. It's a hell of a thing to say, we've spent 6 years building up with Master Trust A. We've decided Master Trust B is better. So we're going to shut our relationship with them. All of you have now got probably quite small stranded pots over here. We're going to start you off from scratch over here. So we really do need to think about the mechanics of what's going to stir, because unless we have a proper competitive market, people can get away with poor quality, and the buyers don't react to it. So I think far too little attention in policy, and I hold my hand up as much as anyone here, has been given to stirring this market up so that the poor performers actually lose market share.
Do we, Ben, need more sort of competitive spirit in this market? Or?
Absolutely, and competitive on the right things. I think it's sort of, you need to define the way, you think carefully about what you want the market to be competing on, and then stir it up. That's the right strategy, absolutely, to make happen what you want to happen, ultimately. I think, to pick up on some of the sort of PLSA stuff and sort of do we need to, is the elephant in the room that people don't understand they're going to retire in squalor. I think we have to be very careful on that. And I'd sort of, so every time, within Cushon, right, everything's through the app, and we like to find every excuse when people do something in the app to flutter them with confetti, right, and make them feel a little bit better about themselves for having interacted with Cushon and with their savings. And that's a very conscious strategy because we want to build loyalty, and people feel good about themselves, and then they're more likely to do more positive things like increasing their contributions or combining all of their pots into one place to get themselves on a better financial footing. What we don't do is, as soon as they log in, hit them with a kind of, ooh, you're not looking good there, you're going to retire in squalor, you're probably not going to be able to feed your children. Yeah, and it's just because it just has the wrong effect, right? It may be factually correct, but it lacks emotional intelligence, and you have to we analyse this stuff, again, through a sort of retail marketing perspective. If you're trying to influence behaviour to get people to build healthier savings habits for retirement, think about how you would do that if you were selling it on a poster in the tube or something, not like, and stuff just doesn't get sold off the back of negative messaging.
This question encapsulates everything that I have long been concerned about in the pensions industry, and it's why I've been so excited to work with Cushon, because the first question we get is about negative messaging to the consumer. Tell them they're facing poor outcomes. That seems to be the way pension industry folk talk to their customers. You're never doing enough. Whatever you're doing, it's never enough. However little and however hard it has been for you to put money in, what you hear most of the time is it's not enough, you need to do more. Government's the same, you know, pension providers are saying auto-enrollment contributions aren't nearly enough, you need to force people to give us more money. Well, if we had a proper direct-to-consumer retail mentality, then I would argue that value for money could partly be about pension providers working with the employer to promote pensions and sell the proposition to their workforce in a positive way, encouraging them to do more, and also telling them how much money their employer is putting in, which they wouldn't have in another savings product. They wouldn't have if they just put that money in the bank. And that's where I think this value for money can be brought together with employer messaging and workplace messaging that could make a really revolutionary difference to people's attitude to pensions, which are a great product. They're a fantastic product. They have so many advantages, so many reasons why you should be both putting money into them rather than into other places if you can, and not taking money out of them, even if you can, because they should be the last money you spend. But we don't tend to hear those positive promotional messages that, you know, you hear for Mars bars, you hear for other consumer products, but not for pensions.
I think there's a piece around building confidence, isn't there? Just to build on Roz's point from a member's perspective, you know, there's a general sort of assumption that, you know, if we keep communicating and we keep, you know, pushing those messages, members will one day wake up and they'll be engaged with their pension arrangement. But actually the reality is, you know, most members just don't have the confidence to do so. You know, the moment they see pensions on a page, they immediately disengage, regardless of what that messaging is. And, you know, not to sort of throw something in left field, but I think there is a debate to be had around that particular point and the messaging and the industry languaging around sort of pensions as a word. But I think the art that's sort of at the heart of all of this, in my opinion, is how do we build member confidence to enable them to really value, you know, all the good things about pensions, because at the moment, without that sort of educational piece being, you know, mended, we can do all sorts of things, but we're not going to get very far because they're just not going to engage.
You're so right. What we need to do is change the language.
Yeah.
That's part of the trick. I mean, if you think about it, when somebody does engage with a pension and they get these bamboozling terms thrown at them, and even, the classic example, this word, default funds. What you expect everybody to put their money into, the vast majority of people, it's such a negative word. Who would want to encourage somebody or feel enticed into something that's called a default fund with their money? What about expert's choice or standard fund or, specially chosen for you? Those types of messaging. And getting rid of accumulation, decumulation, all of those things could be expressed in ordinary language rather than in technical language. But all of us involved in the pensions industry, to us it's natural. We know exactly what it means. And it's not necessarily something bad. But if you think about it from the ordinary consumer's point of view, a lot of the jargon is either meaningless or even sounds negative.
Thank you so much, Ros. Another question from our audience. What does the panel think about paying for financial advice, whether it's through the employer or the scheme, as a key component of value for money? Steve, can I come to you on that one, please?
I suppose I would segment the market. I think there are a set of people for whom regulated individual financial advice with complex financial affairs is, just a good thing. They would value it. They would value it if it's provided. They don't appreciate the value of it until they've had it, but looking back, they appreciate it. I'm not convinced the mass market, I'm not sure that's a good way of spending money for the mass market. I think for most people, their financial affairs are broadly simple, and essentially what they need to do is think about the mortgage, think about the pension, have some short-term savings, and that's kind of about it. So, but I think we can do an awful lot more on, engagement, on guidance, on nudges, all that kind of stuff. So I think the sort of, we on the panel, perhaps we on the call, live in a world where maybe financial advice is part of our life and perhaps we need it, but I don't think the mass market people we serve need that, and because it's expensive, inevitably, is that the best use of our spare pound? I'm not sure it is, but I think being much cleverer, the big behavioural nudge of auto-enrolment, nearly 10th birthday, has been hugely successful, and nobody had any advice about anything as a member, and it got them to a better place. So let's not give up on all those nudges. There's a lot more nudging we can do. I think birthday, let me give you a simple example. My Starbucks app gives me a free coffee on my birthday. For goodness sake, that's not difficult, isn't it? Why doesn't my pensions app give me 50 quid in my pension on my birthday, or whatever it is? We could just be much more creative.
Thank you very much indeed. Ben, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of extend on that, I think there's a thing around brand as well, and I'll sort of draw an analogy with the electric car market, and sort of 5-10 years ago, electric cars were a bit niche and a bit sort of like, if you knew somebody who was getting one, you were like, oh, that's interesting. Well, how are you going to charge it? Have you really sort of thought it through? And it's a bit like that with pensions, right? Sort of, if you are the sort of person who finds your pension really interesting and checks it all the time, that's a bit like, oh, really? And so then along comes Tesla. Somewhat controversial as a company, but what they have done is completely redefined the branding of the electric car market and made electric cars, rather than being a bit sort of like vegan and crunchy and like sexy and cool and fast and everybody wants one, right? And then I think the pensions world needs to start thinking a bit like that as well. I think we need to make pensions cool and sexy as a sort of prerequisite to like enabling all of these other sorts of conversations and deeper levels of engagement to happen. You need to get people into the right mindset in the first place to open up all of this sort of stuff.
Thank you so much. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to one or two other topics. Obviously, there are a vast number of DC pension schemes out there. To what extent can industry consolidation, the consolidation that is of pension schemes themselves, as opposed to member consolidation, to what extent can that consolidation help deliver value for members? Ben, may I start with you on that one, please?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's an important part, you know, sort of almost concentration of resources, scale, enables you to get more done, and Cushon is, you know, of the 4 significant master trust consolidation deals that have happened since the authorisation regime came in. Cushon has done 3 of them, so we are the sort of consolidation vehicle of choice in that master trust space. So obviously we think it's a good thing, you know, but I don't think I don't think it's the most important thing. I think the most important thing is defining a market that will compete on things that matter, and then stirring it up a bit, to use Steve's point. I think that is the way to really sort of, and that will then lead to consolidation, but I think it's almost a sort of an input, not an output, if that makes sense. I don't think it's the single most important driver of getting the market operating in the way that we want it to.
Rose, would you like to add to that?
Well, I think I just echo what Ben was saying there, that there's a lot more that we can do, and there are great opportunities. I just hope that the pensions industry will take advantage of them.
Thank you. Steve?
I think to understand pensions policy at the moment, you have to realise that Guy Opperman must once have sat down with an Australian. You know, I'm absolutely certain he had a dinner, had a drink, and came home and said to his wife, do you know what? The Australians have consolidated, we're going to consolidate. And I think he actually was quoted the other day as saying, if it works in Australia, it should work here. You know, whatever they do, we should do. And there's clearly something in that, and clearly we are too fragmented and there are inefficiencies and so on. But I'm just thinking it's a golden bullet is probably not right either. You know, you've got, if I think of some big paternalistic employers with single employer trusts who are able to say, actually, we are our workforce, a bit Ros was saying about, you know, firms who have lots of low earners and net pay not fitting. Single employer trusts can have something tailor-made for them rather than be part of a master trust that's relatively homogenised. And of course, you know, they've got to justify, you know, they don't want to be subscale and so on. But I do think there is still a case for diversity where you've got an engaged employer. I think where you've got an employer who's just going to pick, you know, something from the mass market, fair enough scale. But where you've got an engaged paternalistic employer who's perhaps subsidising costs for members, who's paying for extras, then just throwing that away on the altar of consolidation, I think, is a step too far.
Thank you.
And I would completely agree with Steve on that point. I think, you know, for smaller employers where, quite frankly, the resourcing, the access to sort of scale, good, you know, resourcing from an internal perspective, on an sort of governance perspective, I think consolidation makes sense, and you know, taking advantage and leveraging the buying power of a bigger trust arrangement is definitely makes sense. I think for larger employers where, as Steve says, you know, you like ourselves, you have the choice to, you know, particularly around comms and engagement, where you can actually drive your agenda. You have much more flexibility from an investment strategy perspective in terms of what suits your membership. I do think that, you know, it's definitely not a silver bullet across the board. I think it has a role to play within the industry, but I don't think it's the go-to and it's necessarily right for all employers and all members.
Thank you so much. Moving on to member experience, I know the FCA and TPR have mentioned customer service, and more broadly we've spoken a lot in this webinar about member engagement and the broader experience. To what extent do you think sort of the experience is a key driver for value for money? Ben, may I start with you with that?
It's absolutely fundamental. In my view, it's again a necessary prerequisite to getting better member outcomes. If people aren't engaged, then they're never going to consider increasing their contributions. They're never going to understand what their actual situation is as they approach retirement. They're never going to consider whether they might be better off in a slightly higher risk portfolio or a slightly lower risk portfolio, depending on their personal circumstances. So it's an absolutely necessary prerequisite to delivering better outcomes and a better functioning industry. And as I said, I think there's a lot of sort of like, oh, it's all very difficult. Oh, it's not as hard as you think, right? There's plenty of simple ways of measuring this stuff that would be would result in a far better functioning market that drives and iterates towards better consumer outcomes than some of the other stuff we end up distracting ourselves with as an industry.
And just if I can give one example that ought to be a no-brainer is paying in more. Didn't that ought to be really simple? And yet, you know, I'm kind of vaguely interested in pensions. Was a member of a group personal pension. I wanted to top it up. I couldn't find on the website where to get the form out, to get them to email it to me. I printed it and it was a nightmare. Well, you know, if we can't even get people who want to pay more to make it easy to pay more, where are we really? And I think, come back to the employer choosing the scheme for the workers, funnily enough, that is something that might trigger a change. Because if the workers say to the employer, look, our provider's rubbish at replying to emails or doesn't answer the phone, ironically, that, far more than investment returns, could be the thing that triggers the change.
Is technology a key driver here, Ben?
Absolutely, because it makes it easier, right? When Steve's like, I had trouble getting hold of the form, it's like, why did you even need a form in the first place? It's like, you should just be able to do it in a few taps. It's again, we talk about embarrassingly simple innovations, but like, that's just so basic, right? People don't. In this day and age, every other aspect of our lives is run through our phones. Why on earth do we need to, fill in bits of paper just to do something that is a very and why is the industry not like focusing on that as a massive problem? Right? You just need to take away the obstacles. Stop focusing on kicking people in the teeth because they're going to retire in squalor because of the PLSA standards. Focus on making it easier for them to do something about it.
And you're competing. So if you think about an individual's available time in any one day, you know, as a product, you are competing against the Amazons, you're competing against the Costas, or I can't remember what coffee company, Starbucks, apologies, of the world. So, you know, if you're not making it easy to access, easy to understand, you've pretty much failed at the first hurdle, because we are living in a fast consumer world. And as an industry, until we can meet members at the point they are at, which is, you know, I get everything on my app, I get notifications, I get things that are relevant for me today, not things that are relevant for 2,000 employees on average, then I'm never going to engage with it, because quite frankly, I could be busy doing something else on my banking app or my, you know, shopping app. So I think as an industry, we really need to focus, quite frankly, on how to connect with the consumer as a consumer, rather than how to provide a product that may fit a vast majority of consumers.
Thank you. Ros, would you agree with that?
I agree. Member experience for me is absolutely fundamental to having people achieve better pensions. That's always been the case. And unfortunately, for many years, we've just fallen behind the way other consumer industries work. We don't even necessarily consider ourselves a consumer industry. And that's a real problem. Technology can help, but you need proper, simple messaging. You need efficient helplines. You need providers who go into workplace or offer online financial education, tutorials, and this simple messaging and this idea of rewarding people for their pensions rather than warning people that they haven't got enough, I think could make a huge difference. We need a disruptor. We need somebody who comes in and shows the incumbent providers that just giving people a product because that's what you've designed without even checking if it is suitable for them or might be the best thing for them, not even asking basic questions about their health or about their plans on a regular basis for retirement or whether they've got other pensions. All of those things could be and should be an automatic part of trying to help people build up what they need for later life, but rewarding them along the way and making them feel good about it. Make people feel proud of the fact that they've started a pension, but understand along the way that, you know, there are good ways in which you can build on that and accelerate your journey.
Thank you so much, Ros. I'm conscious we're running out of time, so a very quick one to you, Ben, first. To what extent can climate change and sort of shareholder engagement be used as a way to engage members and add value for money?
So it's a massive one, right? So the average UK pension finances around 23 tonnes of carbon emissions each year. That's equivalent to 9 UK family cars. Think how good you'd feel about yourself if you switched from being a 2-car family to a 1-car family. You'd think you're making a fantastic sort of sacrifice for the environment and climate. Your pension is sitting there secretly, or the average UK pension is sitting there secretly financing 9 family cars worth of emissions every year. It's also equivalent to 960 of those propane gas cylinders that use for patio heaters. Like social suicide to get one of those out these days. You could take 960 of those propane cylinders, stick them in your back garden, lock the tops off, let them all burn. Just imagine the size of the fireball. That's the equivalent amount of CO2 emissions that the average UK pension finances each year. So complete elephant in the room of climate change as an issue. And there's a direct connection with all of the stuff we've been talking about, because climate change is a mass market consumer issue. It's very difficult to find somebody these days who doesn't care about it, right? And so this ability to create this connection between this really, really big deal and an issue that people care about deeply right now, today, is potentially a really powerful engagement tool to get people also helping build healthier savings habits for the future and address all the other stuff that we've been talking about in parallel, while actually having a really substantial impact on what is the biggest global crisis facing the world at the moment, bigger than Ukraine, bigger than COVID. It's like climate change is enormous by comparison. It's just one of these slow-moving things that's difficult to sort of take on board. So massive deal, I think, and this sort of incredible opportunity to create this virtuous circle connecting these two massive issues and actually getting them supporting the resolution of each other.
Thank you so much. I'm very sorry, but we're going to have to bring our webinar to an end. Before we close, can I ask each of you for your sort of key comments or takeaways from the discussion? Ros, may I start with you, please?
Well, thank you. It's been a really great discussion. I think the key messages for me revolve around pensions shouldn't just be about money and products. They're about people and service. A whole new way of thinking for the industry. Lots of money has been put into the investment side, but not on individualizing to people's lives. And one size fits all doesn't fit in 21st century lifestyles, because people's lives are not really as uniform as perhaps they used to be. So I think measuring value for money must look at individualizing as well as intangibles, not just the things that are most easily measurable, like costs or past performance. And I do like Steve's idea of mandatory retendering periodically, so that it is incumbent on employers to look for a new provider and make sure they've got the best provider for their workforce on a regular basis, rather than once and done and forget about it, which unfortunately doesn't always work very well for employers, and certainly hampers new entrants from being able to gain a foothold.
Thank you so much, Ros. Steve, your sort of key takeaways?
Yes, well, I agree with Ros agreeing with me, I think. But no, I mean, I think the role of the employer is absolutely key here, because we can, imagine the FCA and the TPR come up with some whizzo way of measuring value for money, let's hope. Well, what then? I mean, so is the member going to know, going to engage? If they do, what can they do with it? Because as Ros says, they're in this thing called a default fund, which we shouldn't call that, but that's where 90-odd% of them in most of the schemes are. They're probably not going to switch to another fund. So if the employer is not acting on their behalf, is not reacting, is not looking at new entrants, is not shopping around on their behalf, then nobody else is. So I think for me, if there's one policy lever that's not really so far, I think, been talked about very much, but probably needs to be on the table. It is this, how do we shake up? You know, for 10 years, we've focused on getting auto-enrolment started, good 5 years of phasing, staging employers in, then we stepped up contributions. You know, we've done that bit. Yes, we need to go further and so on. But I think that bit about how to make this secondary market work so that then someone on behalf of the member who may or may not be engaged is making good choices for them and driving up standards is probably the key for me.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Steve. Juliana?
And I completely echo everything that's been said. I think what I can glean from today is it is a conundrum and there's so many different sorts of elements to this, and there isn't a silver bullet to fix this. I think for me, as long as we continue, we're all doing this for people, and as long as we continue to put members at the heart of all the decisions we're taking, and to pick up on Roz's point around we can no longer operate as an industry on a one-size-fits-all basis. We must quite fundamentally move into a consumer world where actually meeting members where they are is key to really, really cracking this value for money conundrum. So for me, it's urging the industry to start thinking through a consumer lens as opposed to an intermediary lens, picking up on Roz's point from earlier.
Juliana, thank you so much. Ben?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's just this enormous opportunity for TPR, FCA and DWP to redefine, reimagine the way that the market operates and works in a way that better serves the needs of the real customers, the consumers. And I just hope they grab it.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of this webinar. All that remains for me to do is to thank you, Ben, Sir Steve Webb, Juliana Oladipo and Baroness Ros Altman for joining us today, and indeed to thank all of you for joining us and viewing this webinar. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.